Trump is not just throwing around loud one-liners anymore. This time, the message is written into the official strategy of the United States government. And that message is very simple. Europe is no longer treated as trusted partner to be protected, but as problem to be corrected. In the new national security strategy, more than 30 pages, signed and polished, Washington describes Europe as a continent facing civilizational erasure, eaten away by migration, by Brussels bureaucracy, by loss of national identity. The document talks about helping patriotic forces inside European countries to push back. Translated into normal language, this means we are going to lean on your politics, support your nationalist and far-right parties, and weaken the European Union from the inside. If you saw this kind of language on some fringe blog, you would laugh, close the tab and go make tea. But this is not fringe. This is the official doctrine of the most powerful military state on the planet. On top of that, Trump gives interviews where he repeats the same theme. Europe is decaying, leaders are weak, Paris and London are destroyed by immigration. Too many brown faces, not enough white ones. Rhetoric that used to live in dark corners of the internet now comes from the Oval Office. So the real story here is not just that an American president is rude about Europe. The real story is that the entire architecture of the transatlantic relationship is shifting. For almost 80 years, the European security system was built on one assumption. The United States may complain, may scold, may shout about 2% defense spending, but in the end, it stands behind Europe against Russia and keeps the umbrella over NATO. Under this new doctrine, that assumption is broken. Washington is now saying two big things. First, Europe, you are on your own militarily much sooner than you think. Take primary responsibility. This is not completely crazy in itself. Europe is rich enough, but the timing and motivation matter. It is not, we trust you, you are grown-ups now. It is, we are tired of you and we want to spend our attention somewhere else. Second, we are going to pick favorites inside your politics. And the favorites are not the boring centrist parties that keep the system stable. The favorites are the forces shouting about globalists, migrants, national rebirth. So you get a strange picture. The president of the main NATO power openly flirting with movements that want to break up European integration and sometimes NATO itself. From the Kremlin point of view, this looks like Christmas. Moscow has dreamed for years about a wedge between the US and Europe, about European division, about Ukraine left alone. Now they see Washington putting out a strategy that talks about quick, face-saving peace with Russia, instead of long-term security for Ukraine, and that barely names Russia as a central problem. Of course they are delighted. So you have a triangle. Washington wants out, Moscow wants a slice of Ukraine and a weaker EU, and Europe sits in the middle, still arguing about budget rules and farm subsidies. Why is the European response so timid so far? Because leaders are scared of three things at the same time. First, Ukraine. Europe knows that if America really turns off the arms step, the Ukrainian army has a serious problem. European industry is finally ramping up weapons production, but it is late. And ammunition and air defense still depend heavily on US supplies. So leaders in Berlin, Paris, London smile for photos with Zelensky and whisper prayers that Trump does not pull the plug overnight. Second, trade. Europe is terrified of another Trump trade war. Tariffs on cars, steel, you name it. Exactly when the economy is already under pressure from high energy costs and green transition. Nobody wants to be the leader who talk tough and then watch their auto industry get hammered. Third, domestic politics. Many governments are already under pressure from their own nationalist opposition. If they are also seen as anti-American, this can be used against them at home. So what do? Classic Brussels move. They wait. They issue careful statements, talk about concerns, hope the storm will pass, tell themselves maybe this is just Trump's personal style, not a structural change. The problem is that, if you look at the architecture of this strategy, it absolutely looks like structural change. The document walks right up to a racist conspiracy theory about Europeans being replaced and treats it as serious risk. It uses language from far-right thinkers who talk about demographic war and civilizational suicide. It frames patriotic European parties as the hope for the continent. This is not an accidental adjective, it is a signal. It also narrows the idea of American interests. Instead of defending democracy, rule of law, all those nice words we heard for decades, it focuses on migration control, business deals, and keeping wars away from American soil. In other words, we care less about what kind of regimes you have. We care more about stopping people from crossing oceans and getting good contracts for our companies. From a risk analyst perspective, you can see the incentives. There is a domestic incentive. Trump's base loves the story that noble, traditional America is under attack from a woke, immigrant-filled, decadent Europe. So Europe becomes a useful villain in the American culture war. Every protest in Berlin, every migrant boat in the Mediterranean, every pride parade in Warsaw becomes part of the narrative. See, this is our future if we do not fight back at home. There is a strategic incentive. By claiming Ukraine cannot really win and Europe is unrealistic, Washington prepares the American public for lowering support without calling it defeat. You can say, we tried, but Europeans are unserious. They like war more than peace, so we, the responsible adults, will force a quick settlement with Russia. It shifts blame and frees resources. And there is an economic incentive. If you undermine EU cohesion and empower nationalist governments who prefer bilateral deals, it becomes easier to pressure them individually on energy contracts, arms purchases, tax standards. One big Brussels table is annoying. 5 small tables are easier to flip. So what are the options for Europe in this situation? Option 1 is the usual. Do nothing fundamental, complain in private, hope the next US election brings a different mood. Comfortable for leaders who do not want to tell voters we need to spend real money on defense and accept real risks. The price of this comfort is that for several years you live with an ally who, on paper, sees you as decaying civilization that must be fixed from inside. In that scenario, Ukraine becomes a bargaining chip. Some kind of frozen conflict or bad peace is imposed. Russia keeps a big bite of territory, sanctions quietly erode, and the message to the rest of the world is clear. If you are big and nuclear and stubborn, you can still redraw borders by force. Option 2 is harder but healthier in the long term. Stop outsourcing your security psychology to Washington. This means Europe finally behaving like geopolitical adult, not like rich teenager whose parents still pay for car insurance. You cannot brag that you are a regulatory superpower and at the same time rely on one foreign election to decide whether you can protect your neighbor from invasion. Concretely, it means 3 unpleasant things. First, money and industry. Defense spending not just at nominal 2%, but actually going into ammunition, air defense, drones, intelligence, not only into prestige toys. Common procurement, common standards, factories that produce shells and missiles at scale without waiting for US Congress. Second, political hygiene. If the White House says openly, we will work with patriotic parties, Europe has to look very coldly at foreign funding of media, NGOs, parties, foundations that push certain narratives. I am not talking about banning opinions, I am talking about transparency. If your nationalist movement is getting help from Washington or Moscow or both, the public should see this in neon letters. Third, strategic nerve. Right now, Europe behaves like a man stuck in bad marriage who complains to friends at the bar but never moves out. If the US is openly signaling a possible carve-up of Ukraine with Russia, Europeans need their own clear red lines. What settlement is acceptable, what is not, and what they are willing to pay alone if necessary to avoid a scenario where Russia is rewarded for invasion. Can Europe do this? Technically, yes. The EU has a bigger combined economy than the US, sophisticated industry, nuclear weapons via France, and publics who already suspect that Trumpism is hostile to them. The raw material for serious policy is there. Psychologically, however, it is very difficult. For 70 years, the habit was simple. When there is big crisis, call Washington. Now, for the first time, the phone may be picked up by someone who says, "Actually, your crisis is useful for my politics." This is the core message behind all the noise. If you outsource your security, you also outsource part of your political sovereignty. Sooner or later, the one who guarantees your safety will want a say in who governs you, who you trade with, which wars you fight, which values you promote. When I was a boy in Leningrad, we learned one thing very early. Do not listen to slogans, watch behavior. Soviet propaganda talked about friendship of peoples, and then you saw tanks in Prague. Same lesson applies now. You can talk all day about shared Western civilization, but if the printed strategy says you are decaying and need ideological surgery, you believe the printed strategy, not the friendly speech at next summit. So the real choice in front of Europe is simple. Do you want to remain an object in other people's strategies, or do you want to become author of your own? Geography will not change. Russia will not move. America will always have its own domestic dramas. The only variable is whether Europeans finally behave like the rich, nervous, but still capable adults they are. Geography does not care about your feelings, and increasingly, Washington does not either. Time for Europe to care about itself.